Hi, I'm Antony Campbell. I taught at Jesuit Theological College shortly after it began and retired from it shortly after it ended over about a 30 to 35 year period from the early 1970s, and my retirement would have been when I was 75, exactly when, I don't recall, about 2009 I think. The book that we're talking about has a background to it. Mark O'Brien and I first of all produced a presentation of Martin Note's quasi-consensus treatment of the Pentateuch, after which we did our own treatment of the Deuteronomistic history, and then our own treatment of the Pentateuch, called Rethinking the Pentateuch. And that was regrettably very dense and pretty inaccessible. O'Brien had to go to Sydney, so I was left to do my own job, which was this Genesis Beyond Sources, that is fundamentally an attempt to take Rethinking the Pentateuch and make it very much more accessible. The book falls, in a sense, into two parts. One very central area of focus is the perception that the biblical text we have is as suitable, much more suitable in fact, to individual stories and serves as the beginning from which a storyteller tells a story, rather than being the end product put together from about, originally it was 4 sources, J, E, P, and D. That's been cut back to 2 focuses of attention: priestly writer, which I would say there is not one, and a Deuteronomistic history, or other various attempts to expand Deuteronomy. The whole point of taking the focus on a story is that basically you can tell a single unified story, and you've got in the text all sorts of alternative variant versions, etc., such as any storyteller would be used to having. And you use stuff or you don't use it according to what a skilled storyteller considers fit for a particular audience. That means that storytellers have pretty much observed the kind of careful couple of centuries of German language scholarship, pointing out where there are duplications within the text. What it does not do, and carefully avoids doing, is trying to turn those into 4 sources, a couple of which would begin, say, with creation, and then go through to arrival in Canaan. If you're only handling a single story, you can focus on the meaning of that story and why it's being told and why it's being told the way it is, which is much less restrictive than the pattern of pulling together a source that is continuous from a certain point in Israel's story to another, in a couple of cases from creation through to the edge of Canaan, in others more recently shorter and more restricted. But when you look at what's available in Israel, the idea of, say, a scroll is absolutely out of the question. Not anything to do with literacy and things of that kind, but very simply the issue of money. To write out an entire Bible on parchment, animal skin, when the British monks did that at one point, they needed 1,600 lambs to provide the parchment. As any farmer will tell you, 1,600 lambs is a hell of a lot of money. And this was back 1,000 years ago or more, when it would have been worth a hell of a lot more. So for storytellers, of whom, by the way, in the Bible, we have almost no reflection of them. What has been interesting in doing this, and what is interesting in this book, is fresh insights that emerge as you treat the material. So, for example, in Genesis 17, you begin a series that goes through to the end of Genesis, which is focused on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as one family, their various connections, and which is very detailed in terms of, first of all, the language used for the ages of these men and their connections, who all lived to great old age, and the way the ages are expressed is unusual. It occurs for these three people, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their connections like Ishmael and so on, and nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, which is something that we cannot say for anything considered to be priestly narrative. Secondly, there's language which you would think was totally ordinary and automatic, such as someone having achieved a great old age, ripe in years, and so on. But when you run a concordance over that, you find it's used in these cases, these three men, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their connections only. It's not to be found anywhere else, which makes part of the Genesis 17 to 50 highly intelligible, but the focus is entirely on the fact that these people are members of one family, which, when you notice anything in their traditions, they probably weren't. But in this case, they are. One of the passages that goes with that is the Joseph story, which is the latter part of Genesis, which in terms of what is happening, it is a story of a homicidal rift within a massively dysfunctional family where the brothers seek to dispose of Joseph, and where ultimately the rift is solved by two brilliant speeches. In the meantime, Joseph has become second only to Pharaoh, and it says second to Pharaoh except in matters of the throne, which we don't understand at all. But the wealth accumulated is such as to be absolutely out of this world. And it is probably an early Western example of what we could call diaspora literature. There's a lot of that further east, Daniel, Esther, Judith, and so on. And probably the best way of naming diaspora literature, diaspora being that area of Israel that is spread outside Palestine. Diaspora literature speaks of cases where faith runs well and truly ahead of fact. There's material outside Genesis that it's just worthwhile being aware of. There are plagues in the book of Exodus, 10 of them. And about half involve Egyptian magicians and Aaron being involved as well. About half don't mention Aaron and don't mention the Egyptian magicians. So probably the best way of handling that, because this is a book on Genesis, is to realize there were two ways of talking about the plague texts and leave it there. Then when the plague finally means that Israel is allowed to leave Egypt, there's a great deal of song and dance about the crossing of the Red Sea. The only thing is, there are two of these and only one crossing. And the two are very easily distinguished. In one case, the work is done by a great east wind. In the other case, the signals are given by the hand of Moses. Of course, the agent in all of this is God. But what is fascinating is the one that we all know, that is celebrated on Easter Saturday in Christian circles and so on. The sea parts to left and right, and Israel marches dry-shod through the sea, which then collapses on the poor Egyptians. The other version, which is found in Exodus 15, verses somewhere around verse 13 following, the other version has Israel go around the sea, probably to the other side. The pillar of fire by night, of cloud by day, comes between the pursuing Egyptians and the Israelites, and they spend the night asleep side by side with the pillar between them. And in the morning, God, at the summit of the pillar, panics the Egyptians, who run back across the dry bed of the sea, just as the sea happens to be returning and swamps them. So we have two accounts of the deliverance at the sea. Following that, there is a small passage of text, about 10, 12, 15 verses, that has Israel go straight north from the sea to Jerusalem. And after that, there is the more traditional view where Israel goes across the desert in a an easternward direction towards Sinai, where they receive the gift of the law and are led by God to the promised land. And then still back at Sinai, they're given instructions for the building of a tent sanctuary and instructions for travel with that tent sanctuary. And it sets off from early in the book of Numbers, around about chapter 10, about chapter 10 of the book of, no, it's not Exodus, it has to be Numbers, and it has the conclusion of the first day's travel in Numbers 11, within between the book of Leviticus, which is all about what it means to be the people of Israel. And after all this, the people of Israel move up through Kadesh Barnea over a 40-year period to get to the borders of Canaan. What all of this means is that rather than, as a general rule, providing the history of Israel, each story is independent and challenges us to reflect on the meaning of such a story. We're not looking at sources, we're looking at stories. We're not looking at stories as providing, as a general rule, the history of Israel. We're looking at stories providing a challenge to us as listeners to figure out, why is this story being told, and why is it being told this way? History, it isn't. The search for meaning, it can be.